For commercial tenants and landlords, more uncertainty.
That industry code, as the National Cabinet reviewed that today, has not got to the point that we believe it needs to get to ensure sufficient security for tenants and landlords.
The key message? Figure it out yourselves.
How that is done inside the lease is up to the landlord and the tenant.
As for the nearly 8 million Australians living in residential rentals,
there's a lot of confusion out there from residential landlords. Is it the situation that their deals with their tenants are being dealt with on a state-by-state basis and not the National Cabinet?
Priority has been on the commercial tenancies given the business issues involved.
banks have given owners a 6-month mortgage freeze, and the government's provided extra protections for tenants.
On residential tenancies, you'll recall that we already announced that there was a moratorium on evictions. That doesn't mean there's a moratorium on rents. If you're not a job seeker tenant, you should be still paying your rent.
But for now, the government's kind of hoping a few decent dollops of goodwill will hold the residential market together.
Do the right thing. It's not the tenant's problem. It's not the landlord's problem. It's not the bank's problem. It's all of their problem.
We've seen numerous examples over the course of the week of real estate agents recommending to tenants that they raid their superannuation to pay their rent. Now, this is not on.
They are playing hardball. They're negotiating, perhaps not in the best faith, but they're doing that in the absence of any real government direction.
We can't afford to pay the full rent rate at the moment when we're out of work.
To be honest, I'm not really sure what the future holds at the moment as far as the rent goes.
What if your landlord told you?
That he's got bills to pay as well.
1 in 3 Aussie households rent. For them and their landlords, the human cost of a housing market collapse is unimaginable. So how long can these patchwork policies keep roofs over people's heads? Well, Dan Ziffer is a curly-whirly cutie pie, Susie tells me. He also happens to be the ABC's business reporter and an all-round mega brain. Dan, why do you think that the government's focusing so much on commercial property rather than on what's happening around residential rentals?
Well, it's probably not much comfort to the 8 million Australians who rent, but essentially it's a bit easier. Residential landlords generally have 1, maybe 2 properties, so you're looking at millions of relationships. Commercial tenancies, where people own shops and factories and businesses, generally have a lot larger portfolio. So they're trying to deal with those first, and also because they support businesses and potentially keep those businesses afloat and people in jobs.
Well, Dan, you actually own an investment property. How are you handling it?
Yeah, the house where we used to live when our children were little has 2 tenants. They've both lost their jobs. My wife works in the arts and has lost most of her employment. You know, you have to work together. We've lowered the rent to almost half of what it was. So, you know, we'll go backwards, but they'll be able to stay in there and kind of keep things ticking over. I will note that the real estate agency hasn't, come to the party. And given that journalists and real estate agents are generally, the lowest trusted professions in Australia, it's really good to see the journos just, inching up there for a second.
They're down there with car sales. Oh, I should say we're down there with car salesmen and women as well. We should just add that, just so that we're not too much alone.
We probably should. But Dan, what you were just saying then about being an investment property owner yourself, it sounds like there's nerves there in your family. That's the way a lot of investment property owners would be feeling. We know the renters are as well. Is there a fair way to resolve this?
Look, we're almost there. So there's a there's an eviction ban. So essentially no one can go anywhere. The big 4 banks have essentially offered to pause people's mortgages for a 6-month period. So we're almost at the solution. People who can pay will need to keep paying their rent. People who can't pay, we're going to have to work out a solution so that the mortgages that are being supported can keep going and that people can stay where they are. We've never had a situation like this where essentially we're trying to put the economy into hibernation for 6 months. People are going to have to work together. Everyone is going to pay. It is not going to be a financially fantastic, year ahead, but we've got to work together.
Dan, if this isn't sorted or if the guidelines aren't clear, what will the fallout look like?
Economically, it would be a catastrophe. The market in Australia, the housing market, essentially supports the economy. We're really focused on housing to prop up the economy. The banks are based on it. Our system of taxation is based on it. So any fall in house prices is going to happen, but a collapse would really put any kind of recovery years down the track. It would set us back a really long way if prices crater because there are foreclosures and mortgagee sales and forced sales.
Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Dan, thanks very much for your time. Make sure when you finish this interview you get out of that park because you're not allowed to be there after this.
Thanks, Tim.